Tov. Today's daf yomi is Nedarim daf Nun Ches, Nedarim 58. Today's daf yomi, we're going to pick this up on the bottom of Nun Zayin Abayz, one line from the bottom. Today's daf, if you look at the pages, it's a very short daf, but it's not a simple daf, and it requires a lot of attention. So we had learned the following question was raised by Yishmael Ish Kfar Yama, or some say it was Ish Kfar Dima. He had raised this question on Zayin Base. And the reason why I raised this question is that ultimately it's going to come back. The Gemara is going to ultimately bring a proof from the mission that we had done on Zayin Aleph. But for now, the Gemara hasn't even gotten to that point yet. So the question that he raises is, let's say you have an onion which you harvest in the sabbatical year, and so therefore it has the law, it has the din, it has the stringencies and prohibitions associated with the fruit harvested in the sabbatical year. But then you replant this onion in the 8th year, and then because you replant it, its bulbs continue to grow at that point. And so therefore, the new growth actually overwhelms the initial growth. And there's more of the new growth than the initial growth. And so the question that Yishmael Ish Kfar Dima or Kfar Yama asks is as follows. He says the following question: do we say that this onion now, since majority of it is now grown in the 8th year, therefore the gidul of the part that's grown is permitted, but do we say therefore it overwhelms the prohibited onion from the sabbatical year and the whole onion is now permitted? Or do we say no, that the onion remained prohibited and therefore you can't eat it? So this was the question: what happens if an onion grows from the sabbatical year, and now it's overwhelmed by the new growth? So they brought this question initially to Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami initially didn't know. So then they first brought it to Rabbi Chanina Tritai in the name of Rabbi Yanai, and he brought a proof from the case of an onion of Truma that was planted, and then this was an onion that was Truma onion, and then it was planted, and the growth overwhelmed the initial part. He said it was permitted for everybody to eat. So we see that once the growth comes, it overwhelms the initial part and is permitted. So even though that was a proof, Rabbi Yirmiyah then spoke up, and some said Rabbi Zereka, and he said, why? We have two opinions that say it should be prohibited. And he cited two cases why it should be prohibited. One is from a young tree of an orla, that's prohibited fruit, which was grafted onto an older tree. And we said, we don't care how much fruit grows, we're going to still prohibit all the fruit from that tree because of its orla. And then the second example was from the case of Rabbi Yona's son, where it says that if you have an onion that was planted in a vineyard, which is the prohibition of Kalayim, then even though you uproot the grapevines from the vineyard, the onion will remain prohibited even after it grows. So that's the second case of which we see that we don't care how much it grows afterwards, we're still going to say it's prohibited. So the Gemara says, but maybe that's not a proof, because maybe they were just being chumrah, maybe they were just there being stringent. So therefore, on our daf, the Gemara is going to give several more examples to try and solve this question. So the Gemara says, 2 lines from the bottom on 57b, element hada. Why don't we bring a proof to answer Yishmael Ish Kfar Dima's question? Min hada, from the following case. The time we learned in the Brisa. Rabbi Shimon taught, and they were on top of Shimon Omer, on top of the Chesam Aleph. Called davar sheyesh lo matir. Let's say you have something which is what's called the davar sheyesh lo matir, something that will eventually become permitted, meaning that even though it's prohibited now, either through time or through an action that you make, it can become permitted. So what's an example of that? So the Brisa says could go in tevel, like a food that you need to take chumah meiser from, but you haven't yet taken it. Or meiser sheni, a food that you can take to Jerusalem and eat. Vehektish, something that's dedicated to the temple which can redeem. The chadash is crops prohibited that they were planted after Pesach and has not yet arrived at the next Pesach, so you can't eat those crops yet. If there's something which is a yeshal matirin, if it's something which will eventually become permitted, then the chachamim don't give a shear to it. Meaning to say, normally we have this concept of nullification. The concept of nullification means that it's called bittul, that you can overwhelm something and the prohibition is like it's not there anymore. So for example, if you have a drop of pork falls into a pot of chicken soup, if you have more than 60 times the chicken to the pork, then you can eat the chicken soup. We view it's that, though it's not there. But if it's something that will become permitted, like tevel, meiser, sheni, or ekdish, or chadash, which you could permit the item by taking the tithe from it. So under those circumstances, we're going to say the laws of bittul don't apply and it won't become nullified. But says the Brisa, the kol davar she'elo matirim, something which will never become permitted, like what? Going truma, like truma. Once it's only permitted for the kohen, it's not permitted for anybody else. The trumas meiser, or the trumas meiser is the meiser type given by the Levi to the kohen. The challah, and also the challah. I mean, say this is the dough that was given to the kohen. The arla, the fruit, the first 3 years. The koya karam, this is fruit that was planted in a vineyard with grapes, which is prohibited because it's called koyim. The sages do say you can apply the principles of bittul to them. Amr lo, so they responded to Rabbi Shimon, shvius ein lo matir, and shvius, the fruit of the sabbatical year, is something that can never become permitted. And the sages don't give a measurement to it. I mean to say shmita is a davar she'ein lo matirin, and yet still the shmita is never nullified, because the Tanan ashvius oseras kol shel b'mina, because we say that the sabbatical year prohibits anything, and if it is in the same substance, we mean to say that if it's min b'mino, it's never nullified. So Amar Lahan, so he said to them, so Rabbi Shimon responds, Afani lo amarti el lavior. He says, when do I say that it is? When do I say this? That it is not nullified. When do I say that shvius is something that's ein lo matirin? For biur, what is biur? Biur, as it relates to the sabbatical year, is as follows: that when you plant, if there's something that's planted in the sabbatical year, you're allowed to harvest it and eat it, but that's only up until the time of biur, until the time where it needs to be burned. What's the time of biur? Time of biur refers to when, as long as those crops are no longer in the, as long as the crops are no longer in the field. So, like basically around that time, you need to make sure it's destroyed. So, if that's the case, so that's where I say it has no nullification, because you could eat it, and so therefore it is davar she'ein lo matirin, because you're allowed to eat it at that point. But if it's after the time of biur, where it's mixed in with other food and you can't eat it, then I say it is nullified because it is benosin time. That is nullified because it gives off taste, and that is nullified because there is no nullification. There is no way to make it permitted, and so therefore it is nullified with the flavor that it gives off. I mean, say if it doesn't give off flavor, you can eat that item. So anyway, we see from here that it says explicitly that the sabbatical year is something where it is. We say that these laws apply to the sabbatical year. A sabbatical year is something which becomes, he had said initially, is something which can become permitted during this time. Look at what the Ran says. The Ran explains it as follows. The Ran says, klomar, im nisarvu la'achar abir, if it got mixed up, if this fruit from the sabbatical year got mixed up after the time we're supposed to be burned, that if you will say that its mixture is prohibited, you'll never be allowed to eat it because it won't be nullified. Then it's prohibited if it gives off taste. We see from here, so he says, so the Ran explains, we see from here that its growth does not go after the main part, because presumably we're talking about an onion also, which could have been coming from the 6th year, which started to grow in the 7th year. And so therefore the onion, even though it was permitted in the 6th year, it's now going to be permitted. Because if that's the case, how would sabbatical year be prohibited with its growth? So certainly we say ein gedulan geikar, because if we're certainly going to say that the growth is not like the initial part, and so therefore so too, that's from the 7th year to the 6th year. It's not going to be like its initial part. And so therefore, we're going to say mal, and therefore we're going to say it overwhelmed it. So here we're saying it to be strict. So the Gemara says, well, maybe that's only the case here. We're saying it to be strict. So the Gemara says, maybe in this case, we're just trying to be strict. And that's why we're saying that the growth from the 7th year will overwhelm the 6th year. But in the case to be lenient, to allow, which was Yishmael Fardima's question, to be lenient from the 8th year to the 7th year, that we're not going to say. So therefore, the Gemara still wants to resolve this question. So the Gemara says, element hadap shatter. So resolve the question from the following. It's a nine. We learned, but Salam, let's say you have onions. Sheyardu aleihem geshem. Let's say you have onions that the rain came down on them. So basically, you have onions that were basically harvested in the 6th year, that they grew in the 6th year. You harvested them, and then you replanted them in the 7th year, and now it's rained upon them. And we want to know if this is an onion that grew from the 6th year or from the 7th year. If their leaves were dark, then we're going to say asur, and we're going to say it most probably grew from the 7th year, and it's prohibited. But orikon, if the leaves were not dark, then we're going to say it most probably grew from the 6th year, mutar, and it's permitted. And he says if you could grab hold of the leaves and pick up the whole onion, then asur, and then we're going to say it's going to be prohibited, because we're saying in this case it's obvious that it's grabbed hold well, and the leaves are attached to the onion, and so therefore it's clearly growth from the 7th year, and it's prohibited. Ukinegda on Motzei Shvius, and it's the opposite in the Motzei Shvius, meaning to say in the 8th year that if the leaves are dark, it's clearly it grew from the 8th year and not the 7th year. So we see from here that if it grows like this in the 8th year, and the leaves are dark, we're going to say it overwhelms the onion that was harvested in the 7th year, and it's permitted. When Meimra, this proves the Gidui Heter Malanas Iser. This proves that something that grows in a permitted manner in the 8th year overwhelms the prohibited part. And I could answer Yishmael Fardima's question. Mara says, no, that's not a good proof. Maybe that scenario is talking about a specific case. Doma Duchanin. Maybe what we're talking about is where you took the onion, you crushed it up, and then you replanted it. So yes, it was replanted in the 8th year, but it was almost like a new onion. It's like the case in our Mishnah where the initial seed disintegrated. And so since the initial seed disintegrated, therefore we're going to say it's like a new onion. So since it was Medudachin, then we're not going to say it's the same onion as the 7th year. So maybe that's why this case is different, and that's why we could be lenient in the 8th year. So the Gemara says another attempt to try and answer Yishmael Fardima's question. We're on the top of Nun Chasam Beis. Well, what's the case? Let's say a person is hoeing he's taking the extra produce out of his garden or out of his field in order to make it a better field, and he's doing this with kuti. A kuti is a Jew who doesn't keep the laws of sabbatical year, and he's doing chasios. We don't know exactly what these chasios are yet, but they are a type of vegetable which the Gemara is going to explain where the seeds don't disintegrate. But right now we don't know in the Gemara. But I'm giving you the spoiler alert, because otherwise you're going to be asking what is a chasios. And so it's a type of vegetable where the seeds don't disintegrate, i.e. like an onion. So, but the Gemara doesn't know that yet. So this is a tosefta, and so somebody's hoeing the sabbatical year ground, the field of chasios. Even though you haven't taken a tithe yet, you're allowed to eat in a temporary manner, and we don't have to be concerned. So meaning to say you don't have to be concerned about Truma Meiser, because you're allowed to eat from these chasios in a temporary manner without tithing them. But there's another concern. What's the other concern? Maybe the kuti has planted, even though if it would be a new plant, it would be permitted. But let's say the kuti had planted something that itself had been harvested and prepared to eat, and then you replant it. Then we might think we have to be concerned that we can't even eat it in a temporary manner. So that would be a concern. So, but here we don't have to be concerned about it because we could say that for sure he bought these chasios which were planted, he bought them in the marketplace. And so therefore, since he bought them in the marketplace, they probably were tithed at that point. So so therefore that's not going to be a concern. And so we say, and somebody who purchases this has to take certainly meiser from them and not tevel. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar taught, Im Yisrael chashad al shvius, Motzei shvius mutter. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said, if this is something that was coming from a Jew who was chashad al shvius, meaning this kuti was suspected of not observing the laws of shvius, then we're going to say, and the person was working with him after the sabbatical year. Then we're going to say that presumably these things were even though they must have grown from the sabbatical year, nevertheless we're going to say they're mutter, they're permitted, because we're going to say under those circumstances for sure there was growth afterwards and the 8th year, and then it nullified the sabbatical year. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is not arguing with the Tanna Kama, he's saying a different law, and this is the part of the law that's relevant for what we're saying, that even if he planted something which was suspected during the sabbatical year, even if he planted this in the 8th year, we're going to say it overwhelms the produce of the 7th year, and therefore it's permitted. So doesn't this answer Ishmael and Bardima's question? It's something that grows in the 8th year. The Gidui Yeter overwhelms the growth of the 7th year. We're in Nimchas base. So the Gemara says no, but maybe it's the same. Maybe here the reason why the Gemara says maybe the Bryce is talking about a case. The Dilma Badavar Shazaro Kawa. Maybe the reason why it's permitted is because in the 8th year, the growth of the 8th year, it's not going to be prohibited because it's a new growth, really, so to speak, because the seed has disintegrated. We're saying that let's say if you planted wheat, by the time it gets to the 8th year, the initial seed disintegrated. It's no longer the seed from the 7th year. It's a new seed. It's a new plant. And so maybe that's why it's permitted. And there we're saying, according to everybody, when it comes to the tvua, the grains, then since the seed disintegrates, the giduim don't follow after the ikar because the ikar is not there anymore. But something where the zara is not disintegrate, then maybe the giduim will become prohibited, like the ikar. Mar says, Vatanya, it can't be that we're talking about something which the seed disintegrates because it says Elohein chasayos. What we know, what are these chasayos? These are these types of vegetables where the seed does not disintegrate. It's the initial seed. What are they like? Go in haluf. This is the type of bean, ashum, the garlic, vabatsalim, the onions, and all these things. Their seed does not disintegrate. The Gemara says, but maybe we're talking about even if it is a chasayos, and even if it is the onions in which the seed does not disintegrate, maybe it's the same answer we gave before. Maybe it's the type of case where the seed of the onion was crushed up and you replanted in the ground. So therefore, that's what the reason why we say you're not prohibited, because the onion was crushed up. The Gemara says, no, we don't want to give that answer because we're not talking about that, because it says chashud al shvius katani, because it says we're talking about a person who was chashud al shvius. He was not careful about the sabbatical year, meaning to say he doesn't care about the laws of the prohibition of shvius. So if that's the case, if he's chashud al shvius, why would he crush up the seed and break it down before planting it again? So therefore that can't be the case. So the Gemara says v'dilma b'tarovas. Maybe the Bryce is not. Maybe the only way the Bryce is allowing him to eat is if it became mixed up with the other foods. Maybe that's what's going on. That there was a mixture of these chasayos that are prohibited with other chasayos which are permitted, and therefore it's prohibited in the majority. So the Gemara says, no, we're not going to give that answer either. Why? Because hamenachesh katani. Because we said at the start of the brisa that he was hoeing out the other vegetables, meaning to say so it implies that he's eating it while he's still harvesting it, and so therefore we're not going to say that this is a concern of tarobas because each one is picked up by itself, and so therefore it's not logical to say that it's tarobas. So we see from here that in this case he's allowed to eat it because the heter overwhelms the initial isur, and so doesn't this refute the proofs that we have brought on Nun Zion Amabeis, we had brought one to allow it, and that was the proof of Rabbi Chanina Tritai, and then we brought two against it. Who were the two that were against it? Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan. So isn't this a refutation against Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan? But the Gemara only says maybe against Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe there's a refutation of Rabbi Yochanan who said with respect to the Arla that if you have that the initial prohibition remains, Uda Rabbi Yonasan, and maybe it's a prohibition against Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yochanan brought the case from Arla, and Rabbi Yonasan brought the case with respect to the Klaya Kerem. And here we're seeing, with the case of this sabbatical year, that the new fruit will become, that the onion that goes into the 8th year will then become permitted. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shanya Shvius. Now there's a special reason why the onion that goes into the sabbatical year is becoming permitted. All the Surah Ayadei Karka. It's fundamentally different than the prohibition of Orla and the prohibition of Klaya Kerem, because this is a prohibition that comes from the ground. The Kedusha Sakarka, the holiness of the ground, that's what causes the prohibition, as it says, V'shavsa Aretz. Therefore, Betelta, Betelasa, Nami Ayidei Karka. So therefore, the nullification, the prohibition of Shvius can come also through the ground. And so therefore, when it becomes the 8th year, the prohibition becomes permitted. Unlike Orla, which is not from the ground, that has to do with the time of the fruit, and the Klaya Kerem, which is an action that you do. So the Gemara says, but we don't like your answer, Rabbi Yitzchak, because Haray Meiser di Surah Yidei Karka. What about the fact that there's a prohibition of something becomes required to be tithed if it grows from the ground? And nevertheless, we say Ve'ein b'teila also Yidei Karka. The nullification does not happen by planting it in the ground, because we weren't in the price. So the Tanya, which are Meiser? Let's say you have amount of fruits that were Meiser that he gave to the Levi, which is Tevel, meaning to say, because the Levi has not yet taken off the Trumas Meiser, Shezara Bekarka, that you planted in the ground, Vishbicha, and now you have a lot of growth from this in and you meaning to say you planted it prior to the sabbatical year, and then it grows in the sabbatical year, and it's 10 times the amount. So on one hand, Chayavas b'Meiser, we're still going to say you have to take the Meiser in it, meaning say you have to take the Trumas Meiser that you required of it before it planted. And even though its growth is from the sabbatical year, and the sabbatical year, normally you're exempt from the Meiser, and so therefore, you might have think that you're exempt from it. Since it's still the original Meiser, you still have to take the Meiser from it now. Uba Shvius, and on the other hand, with respect to the Kedusha of Shvius, it's going to be, we're going to view it as the sabbatical year, and so therefore you need to eat it prior to the time of the Bior, which we said is the time that it gets destroyed in the field. Uba va'osa litra Meiser alamin makom achar lefi cheshbon, and from that initial Meiser, you do need to take Meiser from it from another place. So it has the stringencies of both Shvius and Meiser. And so we see from here that we view this initial liter, even though it goes from the ground, we are going to view its prohibition still remaining even in the even though it's now becoming permitted. So even though it grew presumably in the permitted manner of Meiser, because it was the sabbatical year growth. And so this is a difficulty on Rabbi Yitzchak, who says something that goes from the ground is going to be nullified from the ground. So the Gemara says, no, Amri, no. With respect to Meiser, it's not a din from the ground. Meiser digan hudikagarmoy. Meiser is something that's caused not from the ground, but from when it's piled up. When you pile into a pile, that's when the prohibition of Meiser applies. So the Gemara still hasn't really completely answered this question, because the Gemara is still going to be in the middle of the discussion of what's going to be the story with the food the onion that grew in the 8th year, whether it overwhelms it. At this point, the Gemara seems to be saying that it's permitted, but the Gemara is still in the conversation. Stop here, and everybody is welcome to join us for the davening this morning.